Hello, my name is Robert Fenner. I'm a partner at Taylor Wessing in the corporate department. Welcome to this webinar this morning on the gaming industry, which enjoys an incredibly buoyant period, particularly during the pandemic and the lockdown. It's one of those industry areas which has really benefited during this period. It's seen record numbers of deals and soaring valuations. Gaming is a global market, and so today we have an international array of speakers. We have Louise Connolly-Smith from London & Partners. We have Kartik Prabhakara from Areem, which is one of the top corporate finance firms specializing in the game sector. We have Tim Dickens from DR & Adju. They are our partner firm in Korea with some 200 lawyers. And as you know, Seoul is one of the game centers in the world. And then we have me, I'll come back and talk a bit about M&A, and Graham Han, my partner, who's a commercial and IP partner specializing in the gaming sector in London. There's a question and answer box which you can fill in. So if you do have any questions at any point during the course of this presentation, please just put them in there and we will either answer them as we go along or at the end of the session. So that's who you're hearing from today. Now, just a quick word about Taylor Wessing. We're an international law firm. We've got offices in 16 different jurisdictions, a total of 28 different offices, heavily focused around Europe, plus offices in Asia and representative offices in the US. We have a dedicated gaming practice, and we've been acting for gaming companies for very many years with a large number of different gaming companies as clients. Experience in the gaming sector, you can see some of the recent deals that we've been involved in here. These are all M&A and funding deals which we've done over the last year or two. So you've got a heavily expert panel today, and I will now hand on to Louise from London & Partners, who's going to give you an overview of the gaming industry within London.
Thanks, Robert. That's really kind. Hello, everyone. As Robert said, I'm Louise Connolly-Smith. I'm from London & Partners. I'm just going to say this for a joke. We are not a law company. I often get asked if we're a law company. We are, in fact, the promotional organization for London. So we help overseas companies come to London insofar as we make the case for them as to why, if they were going to expand globally, why they should be coming to London and not necessarily going to Berlin or Dublin or California. So we work with any company from anywhere in the world in any sector, but I'm particularly going to be focusing on the games sector, obviously, today. And we also help London-based companies go overseas. So we have a program called the Mayor's International Program, and we work in cohorts and we help games companies go overseas and expand. And there are a number of companies that we've worked with, that one of them in particular I mentioned quite a few times in this presentation. So if any of you are wanting to know more about the support we provide, do let me know. You've got my email, and I'm delighted to sort of help you on that. So without further ado, the thing that I really want to talk about in London is, the UK as a whole is a really strong market for the games industry. To Robert's point, in particular, during the pandemic over the last year, we have really seen this accelerate. So we've seen that the games revenue has been growing and is continuing to grow. Last year was an exceptionally strong year. I think all of our speakers really focus on just what the pandemic has done to drive take-up. And I think it's across every sort of device. So whether it's on consoles, whether it's on PCs, whether it's on mobile. And I think one of the things that you particularly saw during the pandemic is while events weren't able to necessarily happen, as in physical events, people were doing online games. So streaming platforms like Twitch or YouTube have seen a significant growth. And I think a lot of what you have in the UK and in London specifically is where everything sort of meets. I mean, the UK is the second largest games market after Germany. and the sixth largest in the world. And London, I mean, there are really strong clusters across the UK. Guildford has a very strong cluster. Manchester has a strong cluster. Brighton does. But I have to say, over 20%, 28% in fact, sits in London. And some of the really big global successes have been created in London. So Football Manager is created by a company called Sports Interactive. They're actually based in East London in an area called Here East, which is on the Queen Elizabeth Park. And they just announced yesterday, in fact, that they are doubling their office space. So they are over 200 people now on that office. They are recruiting for 30 more people. And they've just said it's been and it's been really interesting because I know their studio director, who wasn't necessarily a fan of working from home, and of course has said, and it's worked. He said while he wants to come back to the office and while he's increasing his office footprint, working from home, because they are a digital native company, they were able to sort of adapt to that really easily. Another game that's been wildly successful over the last year is a game called Fall Guys by Mediatonic, again a London-based company, again really successful. And then Candy Crush has been created by King, and I talk about them later on as well. I think the other thing that we've really had is we've had quite a lot of VC investment. I've got a slide about this later, but the VC investment, not just for games, but across everything, has grown year on year. I mean, it's just extraordinary how many, London is the strongest sector for VC funding in the whole of Europe. And this has been a continuing trend for the last years. Obviously, we are nothing compared to San Francisco. I'm going to be quite honest about that. But compared to the rest of Europe, this is where the VC market is. And it's particularly interesting because it's not just UK VCs, it's actually international funds that are moving here as well. And I would say the strongest reason the game sector has been growing so fast and so strong from the developer point of view and the publisher point of view is the video games tax relief. It allows companies to get 20% back. I don't know how many games companies are in our audience, but if you're not in the UK and you're thinking about establishing and you're thinking about what are the tax benefits, this is the biggest tax benefit. And it can't, the amount of companies that claim it successfully is staggering. I think the benefits of London are, you have, as I've talked about, you have the access to capital. You have professional advisors like Taylor Wessing who really know games. Taylor Wessing have got such experience. They work with small companies, they work with large companies, they have an international remit. And I think the professional advisor network in London is very strong. You have access to markets. I mean, it's been very interesting. I have to be honest, people have said during Brexit, well, are people really going to come and set up in London? The reality is we've worked with more companies in this current financial year coming to London than we did in the year before. So I can tell you for 100% fact, companies are still coming to London. All the government and regulators are here at the moment. So you've got Department of Culture, Media and Sport, Department for International Trade. You've got membership organisations like United Kingdom Interactive Entertainment, as well as TIGA. And you've got the technical infrastructure, which is sort of really key. What's really interesting is that people who work here, so Roberta Luca, who's one of the companies I spoke about, she was on the international business program I mentioned. Her company have raised $30 million from NetEase to expand into China, but they are also in New York. And one of the things she says about London is she has over 20 different nationalities in her company. And she said it's that diversity that really helps them differentiate and helps them also have more inclusive thought in their company and be more able to be nimble and change the way they're doing things. We've talked about how people are using games across the world and how this is driving uptake. One of the things that I also wanted to mention is, even though we're not able to do physical events at the moment, there is an event called the London Games Festival. It happens every year. And last year it pivoted to digital. This year it will be digital again. Next year they really hope to be a physical event. But they attract an international audience. They particularly do a VC developer pitch event. It's called the London Finance Market, which is a really interesting event where they match the VCs with developers/publishers. So I think that's an interesting space that London is trying to develop, that particular market. And that happens every March. So that will be happening at the end. The business section of this event is happening between the 22nd to the 26th of March. And I think tickets are £50 for the digital element and are on sale, I think now or imminently. I think one of the reasons that London has grown its sort of games market so significantly is the developer talent. So there are over 350,000 developers in London. It's a huge market of talent, and that is one of the reasons people come and grow here. And I'm aware of the time. I wanted to give you a sense of some of the businesses that are here. So I've talked about Candy Crush, which is created by a company called King. King are based in Soho. They have a studio there for 300 people. We've got Sony, who are also based in Soho with a very large development studio. King are, in fact, owned by Activision. Activision are a North American company. They are a publisher of games, but they also have a franchise called Call of Duty, which I'll refer to later. You also have this, I know Kartik, who's going to speak after me, is going to be talking about some of the M&As that's been happening. But EA, for example, did a huge deal in the UK last year. They bought a company called Codemasters, who are based out in Warwickshire. A huge deal. You have companies like Improbable, who did the single largest fundraise, I think, in the whole of the UK. They raised $500 million a couple of years back. And then you have a company that's not on here, that really should be on here, is Tencent. So Tencent have a pretty much one-man presence in London. However, they also invest in Riot Games. They've invested in Ubisoft. They've invested in another company that should be on here called Epic. So Riot Games, for those of you who know, run Fortnite, have a London presence. London and Partners help bring them to London. Epic run the Unreal Engine and have a London Innovation Lab. And Unity, another company that has a platform where companies are developing products and software. So there's a very interesting convergence of platforms, developers, games companies, and they're all based in London. I've mentioned about Improbable. As I said, they raised over $500 million. And Herman Narula said particularly that although they've expanded globally, London is their HQ, and it's because of the talent that's here. I've sort of talked about the VCs. Last year, 10.5 billion investment happened in London. I've mentioned Improbable, but the other thing that's quite interesting is you're also having the mergers and acquisitions thing. And then that means that the smaller companies are becoming investors themselves. So when they successfully are acquired, they then start investing. And I think that's one of the areas where you see people who are sector experts start investing in the sector themselves. I've mentioned the video games tax relief. I think the other thing that we've seen that's been quite interesting, so for those of you who are aware of a company called Razer, they are a huge brand. They have an esports part. They run hardware. They run software. And they opened their largest store in December of 2019. And that's their largest store globally in London. And I wanted to talk about esports briefly. Esports has really grown in the last year. I mentioned Activision run the Call of Duty franchise. London has its own Call of Duty team called the Royal Ravens. Obviously, last year they were unable to run any events, but they are based out of the Copper Box, which is on the Queen Elizabeth Park. And hopefully in 2021 or 2022, we will be coming back to live events. You also have Face It, who are a significant studio. They run events. They also run their own platforms. They raised about $19 million about 2 years ago. Fnatic, again, run a number of esports teams, also have significantly raised money. So there is a burgeoning esports scene. Excel Esports are based out of Twickenham in London. Again, growing rapidly, significant funding. So I think what you're seeing is this ecosystem of London of finance, of games companies, of developers, and once we can, of events. So obviously lots of events have gone online. Pocket Gamer Connects is a physical event but has in fact started doing more events online. And I think the other thing that's hopefully going to happen is Madison Square Garden are going to be putting in planning permission for a sphere just near Stratford, and it's going to be a sphere which can host 21,000 people. So I think the opportunity in London is seen by global brands like Madison Square Garden. But interestingly enough, also in East London, I mentioned that Sports Interactive are based at Here East. Here East are developing out as an esports cluster. So Loughborough University is based at Here East. They've done the first esports degree, and that's now got a London presence. So there's a very strong cluster in East London developing in this space. And I think Here East are really trying to position themselves as the global leader as the UK leader in this space. They feel that this is a growing opportunity. And so they're really looking to build that out. I am going to stop there. I'm happy to take any questions, but for now, I'm going to pass over to Kartik. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Louise. Hello, everyone. My name is Kartik. I'm with the firm called Areem. We are a tech-focused investment bank based in London and San Francisco. Gaming has been a very big vertical for us. So, over the years, we've worked with over 30 studios on their exits and financings. These have included names like Supercell, King, Jagex, Hutch, EasyBrain, and the big topic for today is the developments in the sector. And one very interesting thing is just the momentum that is building up in the sector, just as it's gotten bigger. So just in the last 12 months since the start of 2020, we've advised on over 13 odd M&A transactions. And it's great to, having covered the sector for a long time, it's great to see how it's growing from strength to strength over the years. I think if you look at the gaming sector in terms of the equity markets and the companies that are listed, few things that are not surprising. One is just given the outlook on these businesses, most of them have performed extremely well, better than the overall. If you look at NASDAQ as a benchmark, globally, most gaming companies have outperformed. And I think this is not just the fact that it's a temporary effect of COVID, but I think interactive entertainment and gaming has truly become mass market, and as a medium of entertainment, it's pretty significant. So hence, you have a massive sector which is over 170 billion or so, which is growing at 10%, and that just provides the right tailwinds to grow, and that's why it's reflected in the public markets. The other interesting thing is a lot of the companies, in terms of, if you look at multiples, it's improved. So there's been a re-rating. Now, part of it is, the entire equity market is, if you look at the growth stocks, they are trading much higher. But also fundamentally, as companies have gained scale, investors are valuing these companies at much higher multiples. What I would like to say, though, is that, if you look at gaming and compare that to many other sort of verticals and high growth segments within technology, I'd argue that actually from a valuation perspective, these firms are still fairly valued. They generate high levels of cash flow, very diversified, and in a growing market. So whilst we're all talking about, these companies and the equity markets being at all-time highs, if you look at it on a relative basis, gaming as a sector is still, at least in our opinion, fairly valued. A broad theme for has been consolidation in the sector, and it's no surprise you've seen Several deals happen since the start of 2020, and I think if you look at this graph, you start to see that there's just been more momentum in terms of M&A. I think few things. So what's driving all of this? So I think first is as if you look at a lot of the transactions, we've gone from a world where gaming was very console, PC centric, it then expanded into mobile. And as mobile came about, that really expanded the pool of developers, but also the addressable market. And since there's been a lot of innovation in terms of business model, ad monetized businesses that have developed, and what has also happened is the scale and size of some of these games has become massive. So there are games that are making close to $1 billion a year in revenue, right? And these are brands with high recall values that are being built. So what is also interesting is that you've had firms like Amazon and Google trying to build their own studios, build games, but in gaming it's not just about throwing money at it or just the resources. There's certain creativity, and hence getting games that work and resonate with the audience and then scale is not formulaic, right? So there's a lot of science behind it, but there's a lot of creativity. And as a consequence, as studios grow, the larger firms have wanted to diversify and have acquired these studios. The other reason why a lot of consolidation is happening is it actually works, because by and large, most of these M&A transactions have been value accretive and have allowed these studios to grow post transaction. So Zynga, as an example, their entire growth has been a lot of their growth has been predicated on some very successful transactions, and that has also played out with many other public companies. Whether it's Team 17, you look at companies like Stillfront out of Scandinavia, Embracer out of Scandinavia. They've executed a very successful M&A strategy. And that's why this pace and intensity is unlikely to change anytime soon. So this is back to the point that I was just making. If you look at what you'd consider as very active acquirers in the sector, they have done extremely well in the public markets as they've built their success on the back of acquiring high quality studios that have then continued to deliver both on the top line and bottom line. And I think the other main point is also that consolidators today, there are companies in the UK that are consolidating. It's a very global market. Scandinavia has been a big hub with many acquirers. We've seen obviously firms like Tencent and NetEase being very active, but also the US. So it's a global buyer pool, but also equally from studios that are being built. These are being built everywhere, whether it's Eastern Europe, Asia, North America, and Europe. So we've seen deals happen across the board. And I think one other interesting thing is just given the performance of the sector, there are some really landmark IPOs that have happened. Unity, Skills, Playtika have all transitioned to the public markets through IPOs. Huge listed in Poland, and again, as I said, is reflective of there's appetite across the globe for gaming companies to be listed on the public markets. And you also have a good pipeline coming up through this year. TinyBuild that's going to be listing in London. You have AppLove and IronSource as well as Roblox that are all going to be public, and this will add more interest and drive more awareness of the sector across the public markets. You've also had the proliferation of SPACs, and SPACs have again, there are SPACs that are focused on the gaming sector, and we've had a few successful ones. Nexters just got announced. It's based out of Russia, but now is listed in the US. Similarly, Play Studios went public through a SPAC. And this is given an alternative means. So, as studios gain in scale, they have multiple options that are available to them. The other, not surprisingly, and this has been slow, but now what we are actually seeing is more private equity activity in the sector. There is, of course, historically, the perception was gaming and how predictable these businesses are. But as I mentioned to you earlier, a lot of these franchises have existed for several years. So one of the recent transactions that we worked with where Taylor Wessing and us were involved in, this was a sale of a UK studio called Jagex to Carlyle. And this Jagex has an IP called RuneScape, which has been around for over 20 years, and they're hitting their highest numbers 20 years after the birth of that IP. So I think there's now a greater appreciation of the growth opportunities here, and so hence you're seeing large private financings that are happening. Goldman and Tencent investing in Voodoo, you have Insight investing in Moonactive, but also private equity firms being more active. Blackstone, which they own Wongle, and this is the broader gaming exposure to the broader gaming ecosystem. And again, this is something that has been slow. If you compare this to some other sectors, whether it's media or software, the level of private equity involvement is a lot lower. But we're seeing that's picking up pace right now. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Happy to take them on. But I think Tim's on next, so I'll pass it over to him.
Well, Kartik, just before we do, I think maybe we can just take, because there's 3 or 4 questions that have come in.
Sure.
Maybe just one of them, which is has the growth in the gaming industry been more marked in traditional video games, online gaming, streaming, apps, or AR, VR, or a combination of them? And has the growth of one of those sectors been at the cost of any others?
So actually, so there has been growth across the board. I think so. Both on the PC has grown. The console gaming market has also grown, as has mobile. So I think part of the thing is it's not one at the cost of the other, but I think it's actually increased the overall size of the market. And part of this is just the types of games, the types of audience that people are now tapping into. It's it's touching more and more people. Even people who don't consider themselves gamers are now exposed to games and actually find it interesting to play. So yeah, it hasn't been one at the cost of the other. I think on VR in particular, there is still it's still fairly nascent. So there have been a few successful ones, but with firms like, I think unless and until there's a lot more progress on the hardware side, which is happening and will happen, you don't see as much from an absolute scale today. It's still growing, but it's nascent.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll come back to the other questions a little bit later. So Tim, would you like to take over the baton?
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much to Kartik. I do see the questions are coming in, so I'll try and get through mine very quickly and hopefully leave us a bit of time at the end after Robert and Graham to hopefully answer the questions which you guys have. So from our perspective, I think Robert introduced us, the analogy, we're based in Seoul, and we've been working with Taylor Wessing for the last 7 years, and particularly because Taylor Wessing is really strong on the tech side, and obviously includes gaming, and the Korean market is particularly now very rife and booming in terms of the development of gaming and what's coming out of Korea. So just as a quick overview to give you an idea, in terms of the market share or size, the Korean gaming is just over 6%, currently employs about 90,000, and I think the government's plan is to increase that to about 120, 130 in the next 2 years. And the growth, last year there was almost a 10% growth in terms of the total revenue generated from the gaming industry. So that does show you that this is a really hot topic and something that's moving on dramatically. This slide just goes through a couple of the key points to raise. I think one of them was the impact of COVID, which it had on the gaming market. In terms of the Korean gamers or the people that use gaming, I think of those, 90% use mobile, which is also quite a significant amount. Part of the reason in Korea too why mobile gaming has really kicked off is the access to very cheap internet and the speed of the internet. I think in Korea it's all 5G, so playing any kind of game, there's no issues in terms of lag or lapse or the internet working. So that makes it really easy for gaming from a mobile perspective. The PC market has grown also, which is surprising because a lot of the PC gaming in Korea is based around PC bungs or gaming rooms, which is basically like an internet cafe where people can go in and spend hours for a very small amount of money and play games online in those PC bungs. So even with COVID, that's still increased over the last year, which is quite surprising. Although the gaming market from the mobile perspective has increased, there's also a push from the Korean companies to challenge the sort of traditional console gaming systems. Part of that is because of the publicity it might generate for them in terms of challenging with the traditional sort of PlayStation and Sony's, and also because of the relative ease which they are able to access the North American and the European markets. From the perspective of the notable gaming companies in Korea, I just give you a sort of a rough overview. As you can see there's quite a couple of big ones. The three at the top are known as the three ends, which is Nexon, the NCSoft, and Netmarble. Those are traditionally and have been the strongest Korean companies around. For top 10 gaming companies to watch out for this year, I've given you the top 10, just as a sort of brief, maybe touch on a few of those. Nexon is probably the biggest one, and actually last year the founding partner, who I think owns around 98% shares of the holding company, NX, he was planning to sell his shares, which was open on the market, and I think Tencent, amongst the others, was one of the favorite bidders. It didn't go through, and Nexon have decided to sort of re-strategize and sort of focus on their current products and get rid of those which aren't performing and investing that money into new products and new gaming lines. NCSoft, I think their profits for last year touched close to 900 million USD. And their sort of big games are Lineage and Guild Wars. For Netmarble, I think their sort of average yearly income is around 2 billion USD. The one for this year, which I think is quite interesting, is Crafton, which used to be Bluehole. They were actually planning an IPO for this year. So that might be a sort of a sector to watch in terms of what they might get, and if that does go through, that would be fantastic. Pearl Atlas, they quite recently acquired the Icelandic CCP Origin, which also helps them in terms of their business strategy into entering the US market. So I think those are probably the key companies which to keep an eye on if people are looking for investment or for expansion. Those are some of the big Korean companies. For Nexon, as I touched on, the biggest one, I think they speak for themselves in terms of what their power and how much funds and availability they do have in terms of development of products, investment into new ideas, etc. Startups in Korea are probably not as strong as maybe London is in terms of the infrastructure. From a London perspective, it's a lot easier for startup companies to get up and going. But it is developing in Korea, and I think the government has had a huge push in terms of startups, particularly with sort of creating regulatory sandboxes for them, giving them sort of tax exemptions on certain things. So that has picked up over the last year. And as an example, I've just highlighted three, which respectively sort of raised 60 billion, 77 billion, and 20 billion Korean won for those startup companies. For the improvement from a legal perspective of game-related regulations, traditionally, the gaming industry was sort of governed by the the Gaming Act, which includes sort of gambling, and that's why there's sort of been quite a lot of earlier restriction in terms of money which could be spent on inline gaming or online gaming and the amounts that were required. So for online PC game transactions, traditionally clients or the adults were limited to sort of 500 Korean won a month, which is roughly $500 a month. That's changed now. So they're able to set their own transactional limits, which is a good thing if you're a gaming company and looking to get more money out of them. Also, the daily limit loss, which was $100 a day. If you'd spend more than that on an inline game, you were sort of banned for a 24-hour period. That's also been lifted. Arcade games now can also be played with credit cards, where traditionally it was only allowed with sort of the coin system. Internally in gaming companies, they've also abolished the blanket wage system, and I guess that's for the protection of the developers. I think what they did was sort of have a one amount per month payment, and it was irrespective of the amount of overtime, etc., that these developers were doing. So that's been cut down, and it's very particular now. So if you want to do overtime, it has to be applied for, it has to be given by whoever the senior person is. So I think that does build in a lot more protection for employees from that perspective. The government has allocated a budget for building esports stadium, and I think they want to build 5 by 2022. And I think they're focusing on Daejeon, Daegu, Busan for those esports gaming stadiums. The shutdown law is quite an interesting law that came about for children. Initially, that was banning children from playing games anywhere from 12 p.m. to 6 a.m. That's also been eased now, so parents have the choice whether they want to enforce that on their children or not. And from a gamer's perspective, they've also criminalized boosting. So that's where a gamer uses another gamer's ID to sort of boost up their PowerPoints, etc. And it's actually quite a stiff penalty of 20 million Korean won, roughly 20,000 USD, and also a suspended 2-year sentence. So they've taken that quite seriously. And then finally, the Korean National Assembly recently passed these amendments to the Gaming Industry Act, the simplification of the game rating process. So traditionally, what gaming companies had to do was apply to the gaming board and go through their sort of internal process in terms of the rating. Now it's self-rating, which is obviously a lot easier, and it's also shortened the period for the rating system for games. Not-for-profit games are exempt from this rating requirement, so that also eases that up. And in terms of the actual professional gamers, they've also come up with a sort of universal contract, which is sort of standardized, also to protect certain of the gamers, particularly with minors that are taking part in these tournaments. So those are good developments, but there's a lot more to be done. And I think there's a few points that Graham has in his presentation coming on that we talk about. For example, in-game looting boxes, etc. That's a hot topic at the moment because the government is considering to bring in regulations as to what would be a valid looting box system in terms of notification, what kind of products would be, the sort of odds of winning those. So I think we can get into conversation with that maybe on the Q&A session, which I think would be quite interesting. So I think I'll hand over then to you, Robert, just to sort of finalize and hopefully get to the questions then.
Thanks, Tim. Actually, I'm going to ask Kartik just to pick up on a couple of questions that have come in. Kartik, I think you can probably see the questions.
Yeah.
So what does the panel think the gaming industry looks like in 10 years' time? Yeah.
So
Please
I think so the question of what does the gaming sector look like? I think so a couple of things. So one is, of course, there are the bigger firms. So you have the EAs, the Activisions, and Zyngas and Tencents who will continue to be active, and of course they'll get bigger as the sector continues to grow. But I think what is also really interesting about the gaming sector is there is a space where smaller studios can actually produce big titles, and because I think, and this is a consequence of the game engines, the what that allows you as a developer to create in terms of quality of games. And as a consequence, I think if you roll forward, of course you'll have the big firms who will use their size and the balance sheet to make strategic acquisitions. But equally, it will see creation of new companies. There are private companies like Playrix and Moonactive that are massive in the mobile sector, and they were not of this scale if you just go back a few years, right? So despite all of the consolidation, you will see that there is going to be space for independent studios, but also for the larger players. So I suspect that, and you will also see, I think, more firms wanting to own content. You haven't seen a lot of that. For instance, whether it's traditional media firms or even firms like Amazon and so on, who perhaps aren't into gaming directly yet in terms of actually owning content studios. Of course, they own Twitch and they have massive platforms. They provide a lot of the technology, but you will see companies external to the gaming sector also wanting to build competence and through acquisitions in the sector.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I shall go on and just talk briefly about the legal considerations in M&A, and then Graham will talk about various related regulatory and IP points, and then we can come back to some more questions, I think, at that point. So just moving on to some M&A points. It's obviously, as you've heard from everybody, been an extremely active period for M&A through the last couple of years, and indeed last year Tencent did 33 acquisitions or investments into other gaming companies. And quite a lot of those were in China, but there were a decent number outside of China as well. And they are clearly a big acquirer within the sector because the Chinese gaming market is a massive gaming market and was really there ahead of a lot of the rest of the world. In addition, Zynga has been reported as having done 6 acquisitions over the course of a 5-week period recently, including buying a Turkish business called Peak Games for about $1.8 billion. So that's another whole consolidator there who's going about buying a lot of different other games companies. So it's a very active market for M&A at the moment. And just to sort of look at some of the legal points to think about if you're going into either buying a company or selling your gaming company. Structure, we tend to structure these deals as a share sale, not as an asset deal. And that's because you want the whole shooting match. You want to make sure you've got all the IP rights and everything that goes with it. And it doesn't really lend itself to splitting out assets. In terms of consideration, there's a lot of cash being paid at the moment for people, or cash and a mix of cash and shares, so that people get the upside on shares as well. There's obviously has been scope, and I have been involved in deals in the past where there was a gap between seller expectation on price and what the buyer was prepared to pay, that people introduced earn-out arrangements into it. I think in the current environment, there's probably not quite so much of that, but quite happy to have other people comment on that. And then in terms of these deals, one would normally have a completion reconciliation, which would be in the form of completion accounts generally. You could do a locked box arrangement, which I won't go into, but that's more of a UK-centric approach to checking that the assets are as expected. But the more traditional is to go through a completion accounts mechanism where you look at what all the assets of the business are at completion and adjust the price to reflect that. Warranties is a big area. When you're selling your business or when you're buying a business, you'll be very concerned about the level of warranty cover that you get, and buyers will ask for a comprehensive set of warranties. By and large, however, the market in most M&A now has moved towards having warranty and indemnity insurance as the means of covering off warranty exposure, rather than having the individual sellers entirely exposed up to a large percentage of their proceeds. So before the warranty and indemnity insurance market matured, we used to have sellers having a significant percentage of their proceeds exposed to warranty claims going forward. and now that's been changed, and deals tend to be very much driven around insurance provided by W&I brokers. And that means you have to run that W&I process alongside the rest of the deal and make sure that it comes to conclusion at the same time as the rest of the deal is ready to complete. There will still be some areas of warranty cover where there isn't, the insurance doesn't cover it, and for that you'd have an escrow set, so that's some money that's set aside in order to cover those warranties which are not the subject of insurance. And the sorts of warranties that people are going to want to cover on are typically, you want heavy coverage around IP, because a gaming business is all about its IP, as well as the traditional areas of the accounts being correct, and employment liabilities, etc. But IP is always a big area of coverage. And then with private equity coming much more into the gaming market now, deals will have all sorts of private equity considerations coming in. So PE will generally pay in cash. There can be a bit of a mix if some of the sellers want to roll over and participate in the equity ride going forward. They might want to take a stake in the acquiring entity. And then you do have to feature in arrangements for the management incentivization arrangements as part of a private equity deal. That has to be built into the transaction. Leverage, of course, is also part and parcel of the private equity model, and as gaming companies have matured and now throw off large amounts of cash, they've actually become a very suitable target for the private equity industry. And so, as Kartik said, you've now got many more private equity-led deals in this sector. Particular points to look out for. Share capital is always a very obvious point on any M&A deal, but do make sure that all of your share capital arrangements are in order, and that includes options and any incentive shares. You can clearly identify who owns what. Second is ownership of IP. This is a very core area for due diligence. And you do want to make sure that whoever's been involved as the software engineers or programmers in terms of developing the games have assigned all their IP to the target company. And you have to have suitable clauses in their employment contracts or their consultancy agreements to make sure that happens. You also need to look at what's going on with open source. Have the open source licenses that may have been used in the development of any of the applied with. Data protection is also a big issue. We have a specialist team in the house that deals particularly with data protection issues, led by my partner, Vin Banj. And since gaming companies hold a lot of data, particularly about the players, you do have to make sure and be very careful that you are data protection compliant across the various different jurisdictions in which the game is being played. And then loot box and gambling issues is a very current issue, and I'm actually going to hand on to Graham, who can speak in more detail about this, but it also comes up in any M&A context. So Graham, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Yes, I'll certainly cover loot boxes, but I'm conscious of time. I was going to talk for 10 minutes. I'll try and keep it to closer to 5. This is an international webinar. We're looking at international growth, so I'm going to keep this relatively high level international, not do a deep dive on any particular law, but very happy to answer questions. And looking back at the questions around what will the industry look like in 10 years, I think it's an industry that has, as we've heard, has grown enormously, particularly in the last 12 months. But let's face it, over the last 20 years, it's a maturing industry, and with maturity comes scrutiny and regulation. So I'm going to try and look ahead. I'll just skip on. So I just want to give a bit of a backdrop. I think there's going to be more scrutiny. There's already lots of policy, and I'll talk about that, and there's already some law. If we take a sort of look at wider markets, look at the tech market, what's happening with the big tech players, the sort of San Francisco and Seattle giants. That is a market that's matured over the last 20 years, and it looks as though it's in the regulators' crosshairs from a competition angle, and that's all around protecting consumers from financial harm and anti-competitive practices. Then you look at an industry that maybe grew up a few years later, and you've got the social media sector. And we've all seen what's happened with Facebook, the recent events in Australia, but then what happened allegedly with the Brexit vote here and the US elections and so on. So again, social media in the regulators' crosshairs, and that, unlike the tech giants, it's less about financial harm and more about social harm. I think the games industry is a few years behind both of those examples, but if you look at the growth curve and look at where it's going, I think as in-game purchases continue to be the dominant force in monetization, that may change, but it's certainly the dominant force at the moment. And I saw a stat last year in 2020, Pokemon Go surpassed $1 billion in player spending. So this is why it's so heavily scrutinized. So that brings the risk of financial harm to its players. And then as games become increasingly social and online, particularly in lockdown, I think that has accelerated it, which was one of the questions. That leads to the risk of social harm, particularly when you look at the demographic of users. And I'll come on to that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the regulators are focusing on around children. So just to give an example of where I think the direction of travel is, I'm going to look at the UK and look back to late 2019, and then I'm going to give a few more examples. Late 2019, we had a report by the UK's Children's Commissioner called Gaming the System report. That report recognised that 93% of children in the UK regularly play video games. Now, I'm sure the UK is not unique in that. It did recognise a huge number of positive features. These kids are socialising with their friends, they're learning new skills, online gaming extends normal play into the digital landscape, children play by the same social rules online as they play offline. Most online social interactions are with children they already know. Children choose to play games with their friends, and they're playing in order to cement their friendships and bond over common shared interests. So lots of positives. For some children, online gaming provides a social network which they wouldn't otherwise have. So huge positive. However, the report did recognise some specific negatives, and it's leading to some recommendations. It recognised, with the growth of online games, particularly in communities of players, it recognised the risk of bullying. And there were a lot of interviews with kids that were drawn out in the report that gave examples of that. It recognised the risk of inequality. If you can't afford skins, you're a nobody. It recognised risks around online safety. Children commonly quoted as being offered online access to skill improvement measures if they shared personal information, commonly playing with strangers online. It recognised aggressive and unpleasant anonymised behaviour, how online gaming can influence mood, negative impact on social development, skills, and the link between gaming and gambling, which Robert's mentioned in terms of loot boxes. And the quote from the report is, "Its monetization is where online gaming starts to look less like play and more like gambling." So the big recognition was that children are spending more time online playing games, they're playing with strangers, and they're increasingly spending money. And that marks a significant divergence from a child's normal offline behavior. So behaviors like spending without any knowledge of what the reward might be in a loot box, and the fact that rewards come in the form of in-game benefits rather than real-world currency, and the link possibility that kids feel as though they're wasting their money. These were all recognised. So where does this lead to? Well, the conclusions of the report was that gaming is a digital extension of play, many positives, but some real risks. Monetization of games brings children closer to gambling. If gaming is an online extension of their offline lives, then the rules should be the same. So the policy recommendations were: 1, limit the role of money. Children shouldn't be able to progress by spending money. They should be able to see historic spend easily. There should be daily spend limits as a default. And loot boxes should be regulated within the definition of gambling, which they already are in some markets. So this is only through the UK eyes, but I think it's a great example of where a lot of mature markets are going. There should be measures around helping children manage their time. Online games should be age-rated. We're obviously already seeing movements there. And online games should be part of digital citizenship lessons in school. In the UK, social media is already taught by that. So just mindful of time, I'm going to skip on. That was the gaming, the sister report. Children's code. So this is a code which is on the statute books now in the UK, and it's enforced from the 2nd of December 2021. The Children's Code, it provides standards of age-appropriate design for digital services likely to be accessed by children. And that's a very wide definition. Children mean under 18s, likely to be accessed means more probable than not. So it certainly impacts the game sector. What does it do? Well, it goes much wider. Even though it's regulated by the privacy regulator, it goes much wider than that. And it calls for measures such as default screen breaks. There's an overall duty to act in the best interest of the child. So again, that's quite difficult to interpret that until further guidance comes out. It's a UK law, so how are you going to legislate for that if you've got a group of players online, one of which is in the UK, one of which is in the US, Korea, Germany, whatever. I'll skip over the next. Call of Duty. So this isn't about a first-person shooter game. This is about a new law coming in to bring in a duty of care for businesses to take more responsibility for the safety of online users. And this has direct application to the game sector. Just mindful of time. So this duty would apply to businesses that provide services or use functionality on their platforms which facilitate the sharing of user-generated content. So this is all about groups of players playing online, being able to talk, exchange views, banter, all that stuff. This duty of care is coming in. It should have been published in terms of detail last month. It's not come out yet. So we're all going to have to watch this space. Robert mentioned loot boxes. In the UK, that has progressed to a formal consultation and a review of the Gambling Act, with loud voices calling for loot boxes to be brought within the definition of gambling. But I think that probably is the direction of travel. But it's not all bad news. So I've talked about headwinds. I think the outlook is extremely positive. We've talked about the phenomenal growth. Louise has talked about London and the UK, access to terrific talent, low corporation tax, valuable tax breaks, sensible legal systems. So there's loads of reasons to be positive. The headwinds may be blowing, but I think the outlook does look positive. And that's not least because I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer and I managed the whole presentation without mentioning GDPR or Brexit. So on that unlikely bombshell, I will hand back to Robert. I think we've got a few more minutes to deal with questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Graham, and thank you to everybody who's spoken this morning. A couple more questions. So one question is, basically, is this gaming boost just part of the pandemic? And once people are released from lockdown, will the growth that we've seen continue to be sustained? So I don't know if who would like to take that. Maybe Louise or Kartik again.
Yeah. I'll sort of weigh in. I actually think it'll be sustained. I think this has been happening anyway. I think the difference is that maybe, to your point about some of the big investors getting involved, I think more people are aware. So I think it's not like this was underground in any way. I just think it's maturing, and I don't think it's going to become less so. But I'd be interested to know what Kartik says.
Yeah, no. So I think one is, look, it is accelerated a lot because it's brought people who had not looked at gaming either, as part of interacting or as a form of entertainment. So of course there was a bit of a bump, and if you see various countries, the patterns, things have stabilized. But if you draw a straight line, it's going in the right direction, as Louis is saying, which is there's growing adoption.
And do you think we're going to see more gaming activity by the likes of the Microsofts and the EA, etc., who've been active recently? Do you think there'll be continued consolidation by them, continued acquisitions?
Yeah, I think Microsoft has.
Go on, Kartik.
No, I was just going to say, I think this. There's no reason to think otherwise. Obviously, both these companies have been acquisitive. It's just a case of what the pace is. But I don't see that trend changing.
Okay. And Louise, sorry, do go ahead and.
No, I mean, I was going to agree in that. I think one of the things that's been interesting is, when I think the challenge is developing the original content. I think that was one of the sort of questions as well. We've sort of seen Google go into the space and then come back out of it again. I think acquisition is an easier way, but I don't think that's going to stop people to try and develop their own IP as well.
And to what extent? So, Louise, what's the question for you again? Really, do you see that London will continue to be a sort of development centre for the gaming industry?
I think as long as the talent is here, and I think to my point earlier on, we at London Partners, we've been watching the sort of the flow of what's happening with projects coming to London. And if I'm honest, I've actually been approached by more games companies in the last year, and I think it's because we've been about setting up in London. And I think it's because there's been some really big announcements of acquisitions. So I think we've seen, to Kardic's points, we've seen quite a lot, and the work that you've done on Niantic and acquiring Sensible Object or Jagex being acquired, I think you've seen overseas investors acquiring, but I also think we're seeing overseas companies coming here. And partly that's because of the legal structure that Graham referred to. I think some of the companies that I've been working with, particularly from Eastern Europe, want to come here because of the financial structures here. But also I think they're coming here because of the developers. Sometimes they're going to be keeping the developer talent in their home markets, but they're also planning to grow out here because they want to use the video games tax relief.
Okay. And Tim, in terms of Seoul, do you see a lot of foreign investment coming into Seoul in the gaming market and more sort of international cross-border deals between Korea and other parts of the world?
Yes, Robert, I think as you'd expect even in the UK or the US for the matter, it is expanding, and the benefit about Korea is it is kind of a gaming mad society. I think I mentioned in my presentation, for example, PC bongs. PC bongs up until probably 15, 20 years ago, there might have been 100. There's now around 30,000 increase. So basically that's the gaming room where everyone goes because it's out of home and it's sort of a quiet place where they can go and play games and be involved in games. So I think the overall impression from the market at this stage is there's a lot of potential in Korea, a lot of strong companies. They produce really good games which are selling really well, not only locally but in the international markets too. So I think definitely an area where we'll see a lot more M&A transactions in the forthcoming quarters or years.
Thank you very much, Tim. Well, we've run to the end of our time now. If anybody has any more questions, then please, you're welcome to put them into the question box or to contact us afterwards, and we will answer them after this event. But I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to Louise, to Kartik, to Tim, and to Graham, all for participating in this event. Thank you to all of you also for coming along and listening in. And I hope you have a very good day. Thank you very much indeed.